This podcast contains discussions of child abuse, sexual repression and sexual abuse, suicide, racism, misogyny, PTSD and PTSD symptoms, and spiritual oppression and abuse, including guilt, shame, and fear. In most episodes, we will be mentioning some of these concepts in a general way without any graphic detail. If any of these topics or other triggering topics will be mentioned in great detail, we will let you know at the beginning of each individual episode, as well as in the show notes for that episode.
Long, rolling river time. You've healed me in too many days. No regrets, no confusion. There'll be no pollution. I'm so thankful I've decided to change my ways.
Welcome back to the Leaving Eden podcast. It is a good day. It is sunny out. It is lovely out. And I am here. My name is Gabriel Hakohen, and I am here with my wonderful co-host.
Hi, I'm Sadie Carpenter.
And Sadie, now I know that we said that we were not doing homework episodes anymore, but this is not quite a homework episode because this is maybe a little bit more fleshed out than something that we normally would do. But in honor of this episode coming out around the time of Easter, we thought that it would be fun to take a look at one particular depiction of the crucifixion of Jesus.
Right. And this is a depiction that is controversial outside the IFB. Extremely controversial.
Yes. And if you haven't guessed by now, we are talking about Mel Gibson's 2004 motion picture, The Passion of the Christ. So Sadie and I have both watched this movie, and we are going to talk about it today. So before we get into that, I just want to say this is the podcast, the Leaving Eden podcast, where we talk about Sadie Carpenter's life in and escape from the independent fundamental Baptist cult. We seek to educate and to inform our listeners about this cult and other cults and, you know, the very real and present danger that they can pose to society as a whole. We aim to promote freedom of mind, freedom of thought, and freedom of religion. So now that I've done that spiel, let's get right into this movie. This movie came out in 2004. It was written, directed, and produced by action star Mel Gibson and former People Magazine's Sexiest Man Alive.
Really?
Yeah, back in the 90s, man. Mel Gibson was like a sex symbol. Like, have you seen Braveheart?
No, I have not.
You know, I'm not a huge fan of Mel Gibson because I'm Jewish, but I will say that Braveheart's a great movie. I love that movie.
I've heard that it's good. That's just one of the things I haven't gotten around to yet.
So, this movie, what's the guy, Jim Caviezel? Is that the guy's name? Is that how I'm pronouncing it? Am I pronouncing that right?
I
is the guy
did
that they
not look up a pronunciation for his last name.
Yeah, it's like Clav. It's Italian. I don't know how to pronounce some Italian last names. Anyway, I think it's Jim Caviezel.
There's no L. I think it's Caviezel.
Oh, there's no L. Okay, so it's Jim Caviezel. He is the man who is playing the title character of Jesus, and that's very interesting. But we will get into that. So Sadie, why don't you take us through the plot of this movie, and then we can talk about, you know, what we thought about it and what, you know, people say about it, what the real controversy around it is.
Sure. So the plot of this movie was kind of the first thing that surprised me when I was watching it. I was under the impression that it wasn't terribly accurate. And in my opinion, this movie was pretty accurate to the events of the crucifixion as portrayed in the New Testament. So, excuse me if you already know this, but the first 4 books of the New Testament, which I believe in the past episode you've called, what was it?
I called it
John Paul,
John Paul, George, and Ringo. Yeah.
is what you called it.
Yeah, I haven't read the New Testament, so I don't know. But I seem to be under the impression that the story gets told several times from different people's perspective.
That's correct. And to Christians, all of those are symbolic. So Matthew presents Jesus as the king. The book of Mark presents Jesus as a suffering servant. The book of Luke presents Jesus as a man, and the book of John presents Jesus as God. So these are 4 different men who knew Jesus, and they all had a different perspective on him.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's like highly symbolic, and that's like a vast oversimplification of the first 4 books. The other thing about them is that some of them follow Jesus' life from when he was born to the end, but other books like Mark, I think Mark only encounters Jesus with like a year left in his life. So they all have different perspectives because they're written by different authors, and they focus on different parts of Jesus' personality. But they also have different perspectives because they tell the story narratively a different way.
So are all of the stories basically, the plot points are the same in all of them? There aren't a lot of discrepancies.
Very, very few. And a lot of it is just like, oh, well, the way it's worded in this book, it makes it seem more like this one thing happened before this other thing. But the way that another gospel words it, it kind of sounds like they happened on the same day, or it sounds like one happened before lunch and one happened after lunch. So it's very, very small discrepancies. Pretty much they support each other. And these 4 gospel writers would have known each other as well. So that makes sense. But what Christians have done when we try to understand what happened around the crucifixion, so it's not just the hours leading up to Jesus' ultimate expiration on the cross that are important and symbolic to Christians. It's actually the entire week before he died. His entry into Jerusalem starts an entire week of events. That includes the Last Supper. It includes his trials and his crucifixion. And then 3 days after that weekend, it also includes the resurrection. So what we're seeing in this movie is just a small part of the story, but it pretty much sticks to the general Christian narrative of what the Bible says happened, with very few exaggerations. So that surprised me about the movie. I thought it would have more kind of off-book moments than it did.
Interesting. Okay, so you're saying that, Mel Gibson really read the book and took it very literally, like what happened, and then put that on the screen.
Yes. One of the only things that is different, that's not in the Bible at all, is one of the first scenes of the movie. So
interesting.
So we open in the Garden of Gethsemane. Or no, we open with Judas being paid off. But the second main scene is Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's praying in agony and praying to the point that he's just very drenched in sweat.
So he knows that he has been betrayed. He understands that he has been betrayed.
Right. So the larger narrative is that Jesus and the 12 disciples are at the Last Supper, which is the famous painting that everybody's seen. And at the Last Supper, Jesus calls Judas out. And he's like, hey, I already know that somebody in this room is going to betray me tonight. And all the disciples freak out and they're like, not me, not me, not me. I love you, Jesus. I would never do that. And Judas is kind of quiet. So all the disciples start accusing each other of, no, it's not me, it's going to be you. And basically getting real nasty with it. And Jesus predicts then that Judas is going to betray him and that it's going to happen that night.
So he knows that he...
Yeah.
So that's part of the movie, is that a few times in this movie. Okay, so basically the plot of this movie is that essentially Jesus is betrayed by Judas. The temple police, basically, they come and arrest him in the garden. They take him and they kind of rough him up a bit. And then they take him to the Romans and they're like, hey, you need to execute this guy. And the Romans are like, what if we just torture him a little bit instead? And then they torture him actually pretty badly. And then the priests in the temple are basically say, no, we still want you to kill him, and so then they kill him. That's basically the plot of the movie.
Right. But it's essential to the Christian doctrine that Jesus knew. So he predicted the night before that this was going to happen. So when he's gone to pray in the garden, he knows that Judas is going to come find him in the garden and betray him. So that's why he's in that kind of agony. Satan visiting Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is not biblical. So actually this interaction where Satan tries to like talk Jesus out of going through with it.
Right, because he could have run away. Yeah,
like Jesus, so he knew, and he could have, like, it's essential to Christian doctrine that Jesus consented to die on the cross for our sins. The idea that Jesus could have, there's a song, the lyrics of the song are, he could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set him free. So the idea that Jesus could have supernaturally removed himself from that situation and revoked his consent to die on the cross is essential to the Christian salvation doctrine.
But the whole idea is that if he had done that, then he wouldn't have really been the savior.
If he had done that, he would have doomed the world to hell. Yeah. So
interesting.
Satan, of course, wants to talk him out of it because Satan's like, hey, he has the power. He can still say no. I'm going to try to get him not to do that so I get everybody's souls. But this interaction between Satan and Jesus, a very similar one did happen according to the Bible narrative. It just didn't happen in the garden. It happened like 40 days prior to all this.
Huh. Okay. That's interesting. Because Satan shows up a couple times in this movie.
Yeah, and Satan kind of... I was interested in how they had Satan kind of in the background in a lot of scenes.
Right. So we'll get to that a little bit later.
Are we going to get to that?
Yeah, we'll get to that a little bit later. So Jesus, he gets betrayed by Judas. They capture him, and they kind of rough him up a little bit on the way. Actually, they rough him up quite a bit. He comes, to the temple priests, looking pretty bad. It's pretty clear that they've been pretty mean to him. They've committed some acts of violence towards him, beaten him up pretty bad. He takes him to the temple priest, and I guess Pontius Pilate figures out what's going on, and he's like, I need to, this seems like some nonsense. I need to figure out where we're doing, because during this time, the Romans are occupying the kingdom of Judea.
Right, and there are 3 ruling powers that are all kind of in charge of different parts of the city of Jerusalem. So you have the high priest and his guys,
and they're in charge of the temples.
Who are in charge of the temples, right? And they are not a big fan of Jesus because he's like dumped over tables in the temples and said that you've made it into a den of thieves. He's called out the Pharisees. He's like broken Jewish laws on occasion, and just like really made these people mad. So they're not a fan of him. But I think this is because Jewish law prohibits the death penalty, or is like only in certain cases.
I'm not sure about that. I couldn't tell you.
I think it's only for prescribed things.
For prescribed sins,
there's some reason, there's some reason that they can't execute Jesus.
Oh, so you're saying they're not allowed to do it themselves, so they had the Romans do it. So
and I'm pretty sure it's a religious reason that they're not supposed to do it. But it might have something to do with the fact that Passover was supposed to start in the next couple days. Anyway, so the Jewish temple rabbi guys are one ruling power, and then you also have Pontius Pilate, who is the Roman ruler over the region, and then you also have King Herod, who is the leader that the Romans have put in place over just Jerusalem, I think.
Okay, yeah, I don't know all the political situation of all of that.
So it's a political drama of all 3 of these people want to get rid of Jesus because he's causing uprising and he's causing issues. He also has a pretty large following. Some people estimate he could have had up to 10,000 people following him or more. They all want him dead, but none of them want to be in charge of doing it. That's the drama that you're seeing played out here. So these 3, the high priest and Pontius Pilate and Herod are all trying to politically pressure each other into getting rid of this guy.
So what ends up happening in this movie is that the priests turn him over to Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate says, okay, we're going to.
Pontius Pilate sends him to Herod.
Yeah, Pontius Pilate sends him to Herod, and Herod's like,
I have nothing to do with this. Like,
this is not my
off.
mess. Yeah.
And so he gets sent back to Pontius Pilate. And then the high priests are putting like so much pressure on Pilate. They're like, you have to do something about this dude. And Pontius Pilate's wife is telling him. So Pontius Pilate's wife had a dream about all of this happening before it happened. According to Christian tradition, I don't think it's in the Bible. But she had a dream about an innocent man being killed and Pontius Pilate's name going down forever in history as somebody who killed an innocent man, which is pretty predictive. So his wife is trying to talk him out of killing him. So when Pilate says, I'm not going to kill him, but I'll scourge him instead, that's him listening. His wife is talking in his ear, like, don't kill him. This is going to be a bad outcome if you kill him.
Okay. So this is making more and more sense to me the more that you explain it, because
you just don't have like
I keep seeing people act in certain ways, and then I'm like, that is not a really logical thing for you to do in this situation, is it?
So that's crazy to me. I didn't think about that until now, because you don't really have any context for like what's going on here.
No. I mean, it just seems to me like, what is the problem with just like saying to this guy, please, like just letting him just do his thing and not bothering him? Like, what is the negative outcome there?
I mean, one of the big issues is that Jesus has caused a disrupt. So Jerusalem is under a lot of political strain, because you've got the occupying Romans, and then you've also got drama within the high priests kind of camp. There's drama about like Torah law and stuff that was going on around the same general time.
Of course, because there always is.
Right.
Because they're always arguing. They're Jews. They're always arguing about the laws.
Right. So, but like that is interacting badly with the Roman occupation, because people are asking questions like what does the Torah say about paying the taxes that the Romans ask of me? And so it's putting the high priest and his camp in a very difficult position, because they kind of need to not cause a civil war, because that would suck. But also they want to be true to the laws, and like they are arguing. There's internal argument about what the law actually says. So there's all this political pressure and there's all this religious pressure, and it basically just makes like a powder keg situation. So Jesus comes into it, and Jesus is like, he's not attached to any of these people. Because he literally does not care how much he pisses off the high priest. So Jesus, we're way mad at him because he didn't wash his hands before he ate properly, because he was on the road and he just like picked some fruit off a tree and ate it instead of stopping to wash his hands in like the ceremonial way. And they were like, so the high priest is like picking at any little deviation that Jesus does that isn't following Torah law, because they want to discredit him. Because Jesus is trying to discredit them. Jesus is calling out the Pharisees. He's saying that, like, no matter how much you follow the Torah, it's not worth anything if you are cruel to other people. It's not worth it to anything if you don't love your neighbor. And Jesus compared the Pharisees to the white paint that would be put on the outside of a fresh grave, which is clearly pretty offensive.
Yes.
Yeah. Like, and the more I learn about Jewish culture and Jewish law from you, the more this makes sense to me, like why that is so super offensive that Jesus would say that. He's like calling them out on their sins, and they're calling him out for breaking Torah law, which, to be fair, he is doing. But he's also calling them out right back. So there's all this like infighting between Jesus and the Pharisees and the religious people in charge. But Jesus is also pissing off the Romans because they're afraid of a Jewish insurrection, and they're afraid that Jesus is going to lead a military insurrection against them.
So then Jesus gets tortured. Jesus gets, he has to drag this. The focus of this movie, that's the sort of thing is that, see, if you'd explained it, none of that stuff that you just said to me was at all in the movie. None of that stuff was in the movie. The focus of this movie was basically Jesus getting tortured, and then Jesus getting tortured some more, and then you think that they're going to stop torturing Jesus. Somebody walks up and somebody will say, hey, maybe you should stop torturing Jesus for a little bit, and then they're like, oh, okay. just kidding, we're gonna torture Jesus some more. Like that's what goes on in this movie.
It blew my mind when you said that you didn't understand like why Jesus was being shuttled between all these three, like the Caiaphas and Pontius Pilate and Herod.
Yes. I didn't understand any of that. It just seemed like they were
like, that just totally blew my mind when you said that, because like, oh, of course this movie made no sense to you if you don't have that context. But like, I don't know like what percentage of Christians really have that kind of context, because there's a level of very specific knowledge about, you know, Jerusalem in the first century that you have to have. Like, and I don't know, like, I know the IFB taught that really particularly, but I don't know if other Christian churches do.
Right. Okay, that makes sense to me.
But that's what's going on. Like, all three of these groups of people have a reason to want him dead. That's the bottom line. But none of them want to be the person in charge of actually doing the killing. So it comes down to Pontius Pilate. So he gives the people a choice of, it was a Roman holiday where he would typically, so Pilate would traditionally release one of two prisoners. Pilate said, okay, fine. I will release Barabbas, who is like a known bad guy, or I will release Jesus. Which one do you want to go free? And the people said, we want Barabbas. And Pilate's like, really?
So this was a scene. This was a scene that it seemed to me it was very interesting, because I had to look up who is this Barabbas guy, right? Mm-hmm. I'm like, who was he? Like, so I had to look him up, because in the movie, so they show up. So Jesus is like, they have Jesus. Jesus is looking all tortured and shit.
Yeah, this is after the first of like 3 torture sessions.
Yeah, so Jesus gets tortured, and then Pilate has him, you know, up there, and they're like, hey, bring out Barabbas. Barabbas is like this crazy looking dude. Like, this guy looks like he has like one eye is missing, and he's just like, looks like, you know, as soon as they let him, like, he's like foaming at the mouth pretty much, and they're just like, yeah, let's release this guy instead of Jesus. But you know what I did? I had to look up who Barabbas was, and what I saw was that it didn't say that he was a known like mass murderer, known like bad guy. It said that he was an insurrectionist.
Yeah, Barabbas is somebody, people will tell you different things about like who he was or what his crimes were. The point is that he is somebody, he had name recognition. Like, people would have known who he was. And I was always told that he was like a known thief, but I wasn't able to find like really good evidence for that. In the movie, it says he's a known murderer, and I wasn't able to get backup information for that either.
I looked it up, and it said that he was an insurrectionist, which seemed interesting to me, but I'm going to talk about that later.
Well, so Pilate gives the people a choice, and they say, no, actually, we want Barabbas to be released. And Pilate's like, fine. So Pilate can't come out and say, like, my wife says not to kill this guy because sexism. Like, he can't.
Right.
He can't, like make it clear that he's bending to what his wife wants. But Pilate.
Also, he's like the leader. Like, he has to go by what the law says, right?
To an extent. But he's like, fine, I'm not going to kill him. I'll have him beaten. So that's when we get like the like literal 2-year-long scourging scene.
Oh my God, that scene was incredibly, like, was very difficult to watch. So first they start out, they're beating Jesus with like switches. And then they switch to like this like cat of 9 tails thing, but with like metal barbs in it. And they just keep like beating him with it and beating him with it and beating him with it. And his body is just like covered in blood. Like,
yeah,
disgusting. It was very difficult to watch. There's just blood everywhere. I mean, this was basically just like a snuff film, you know?
Yeah.
They're just beating him and 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 beating him. And you think, oh, well, they're going to stop sometime. And then they stop briefly. And then they start beating him again. And then when they show other people, like they'll show his mother, Mary, just walking around, and you'll still hear them beating him in the background.
So in Christian tradition, they would typically give prisoners 40 hits with the cat of 9 tails. Traditionally, 40 hits was a death sentence. because generally if they had 40, most people would die. Because content warning for Discord for a few minutes here. The barbs in the Cat of Nine Tails would eventually disembowel a person as they wrapped around the rib cage and wrapped around the abdomen of a person. Jesus was sentenced to 39 lashes, which is like the equivalent, like what they meant to say by that was beat him until he's almost dead, but don't technically kill him. Like, don't disembowel him. That's what they were saying with 39 lashes.
This is okay. So I'm learning so much here, and it seems very gruesome.
But like, this is something I was none of this bothers me.
You had to learn about this when you were a little kid.
Like there are 2 scenes in this movie that bother me, and I'm going to tell you what they are when we get there. But like, none of this phases me. Like, this is hearing descriptions of people being disemboweled by sharp objects and Cats of Nine Tails. That's something that I've been hearing since I was 5. It just like, this doesn't faze me. This is just like life.
So they take Jesus back after he's like, I don't know how he's walking at this point. He's like up. Like, he looks like he's just straight up, like they're dragging him across the ground. Like, there's going to get some like dirt in those wounds. He's going to die of sepsis. Mm-hmm. That's what's going to happen. He's going to like get infection and die.
So they take him back up in front of Pilate.
Yeah. And Pilate's like, you still want me to kill this guy? And they're like, yeah, still kill him.
So Pilate, so I don't know. So the scene where Pilate has a guy come out with a bowl and washes his hands, that didn't mean anything to you, did it?
I'd heard of that, where Pilate's like, oh yeah, I'm washing my hands. That's something that I've heard of, because he's like, I wash my hands in the matter. But Jesus is like, basically says to Pilate, it's not your fault if you kill me. Jesus literally turns to this guy. He's like, it's not your fault if you kill me. It's them who want me dead.
That is something I'm going to get into later.
That is something that I definitely want to get into later.
That's going to be one of our major points here. But to finish up the chronological bit of the movie, I guess. So this is the point where you see Mary, Mother of God, and Mary Magdalene cleaning the blood off of the stones.
Yes.
I bring it up now because that's something that I'm going to have to come back to later. That's an important part of Catholic tradition. But then they give Jesus the cross and they tell him to carry it up to Golgotha, where he's going to be crucified.
Yeah, and so they're making him drag this. Like, this man should not be able to be walking. This man is like, he's like on the brink of death right now. I don't know how he's walking right now. But there is this extended scene that went on way longer than it needed to, where Jesus is dragging this cross across town, and it goes on for like 40 minutes. Mm-hmm. And I'm just like looking at my watch the whole time, and like, he's just dragging this cross across town, and he's not doing a very good job at, maybe because they're like continuing to beat him as he's dragging this cross across town. And then he like falls over, and there's some dude who's like, hey, would you, like, this dude's literally about to die, and he looks like, please stop. And they're like, hey dude, here's an idea, how about you help him carry the cross? And that guy's like, okay. And then he does it.
Yeah, so that's Simon of Cyrene. A lot of these people have names either given in scripture or from Christian tradition. Simon of Cyrene is in scripture, I am pretty sure. According to the IFB tradition that I was raised with, he was a believer, or he became a believer in Jesus because of this whole incident, one way or the other. But he was like trying to do something good out of the goodness of his heart. According to other traditions, he was forced to help Jesus carry the cross by the Roman soldiers.
Which is what we see in here in this movie.
Right. I think that the Catholic, so this movie sticks very closely to Catholic tradition. I think in Baptist tradition, Simon willingly jumped in, and that was something to do with like him believing in Jesus. But they finally get the 150-pound cross, and they're trying to take it up a hill and all kind of stuff.
And the dude who's carrying it is literally like on the edge of death. His body is like destroyed, and somehow he's like carrying this cross. Then there's this extremely extended scene where they show him like being nailed to the cross, which is no fun.
That's one of the only 2 things that gets to me. I don't do punctures well.
But they showed that. They like showed it in very great detail, and all of the blood dripping down.
That's the only place I had to look away from this movie. The only thing that actually got to me.
And so then they take the cross, they put it up, There's two other guys that are hanging up there as well. One of them says some mean to Jesus, and then a crow comes and pecks his eyes out.
Oh, that freaked me out because I don't like that.
Was that in the Bible?
No.
Okay, so Mel Gibson just added that in for fun.
That's just like a little bit of artistic license. And I saw The Birds, the Hitchcock film, The Birds, and hated it. Was scared of birds for like 2 years. So I didn't like that.
So then the other guy is like, I'm here because I'm a sinner and I've done wrong. Can I come to heaven with you, Jesus? And Jesus says, if you have you repented of your sins? And he's like, yeah, I've repented of my sins. And then Jesus says, you can come to heaven with me.
And that is like that's a huge focus. Like so that guy's called the thief on the cross, and there's a Christian traditional name for him, but it's not in scripture, and I don't remember it at the moment. Somebody at home is yelling it out. But that guy, the thief on the so one guy, Jesus was crucified between two thieves, which is important because they were like lowly. So this is supposed to be an additional humiliation for Jesus, because to be associated with like just like petty theft, and these guys who are getting crucified for being thieves. One of them is mocking him and making fun of him, like, you're not so much a king now, are you? The other guy says, I think maybe you are the Messiah. Do you want to take me to heaven? And Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. So that's used a lot, especially in churches I grew up in, as an example of how it's never too late for you to get saved. Like, it's never too late. Even if you trust Jesus on your deathbed, you can still go to heaven.
Yeah. So then eventually Jesus dies. I think it was kind of me watching the movie. I was low key just the whole time. I was like, when is this guy going to like finally snuff it? Right. Because when he dies, that means they're going to stop torturing him. Right.
Yeah.
And like, I can't stand to see these like really gruesome scenes of torture. So I'm just like I'm like, when is this guy going to die? And then he says, Father, I commend my spirit or something. And then he dies. And then they stab him again just to make sure that he's dead. And then they bring him down. And you get this shot of Mary, Jesus's mother, cradling him, which I think was based on, I've seen it in like a statue somewhere.
It's based on, there's either a statue or a famous painting. There are lots of Renaissance paintings and statues based around kind of that moment when Jesus' body is removed from the cross and his mother is cradling or holding, usually holding his head. That is a piece of religious iconography that has been done many, many, many times.
Yes. And so then the movie, it gets towards the end of the movie. Well, this is pretty much the last scene of the movie. There's a big earthquake which like splits the temple, and then.
So, do you want to know what that is?
What is that?
So there are all of these miraculous events that happen at the moment that Jesus dies. Some are portrayed in the movie. So in the movie, you see that there's a solar eclipse, or the Bible says the sun goes black. A lot of scholars think that might have been a solar eclipse. There's an earthquake. The temple is damaged. In the Bible, it says the veil, so the thick knit, several feet of thick cloth that hung between what is the outside part of the temple called, in the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant is. So that thick like veil, it's called the temple veil, but it's a thick piece of cloth that separates the two rooms of the inside of the temple. According to the Bible, what happened is that veil of cloth ripped in half from the force of the earthquake, or from the finger of God, as a lot of people believe. One thing that wasn't shown in the movie, and I was very disappointed, is that dead people in Jerusalem were resurrected and got out of their graves and walked around. I was really mad they didn't show that in the movie.
Interesting.
Because
I've never heard that. That's wild.
I was like, where are the zombies? Yeah, so when Jesus died, the sun went black. There was a massive earthquake. The veil in the temple was ripped. And the other thing that was supposed to happen is that there were dead people resurrected. So I was a little bit mad that didn't happen. And what we got instead was the scene of Satan kind of screaming.
Yes, Satan was screaming in like this sort of pit. In this sort
Which
of like,
is interesting because theologically, theologically, the crucifixion doesn't complete the redemption. Like, theologically, it's not complete redemption unless Jesus rises from the dead. So really, Satan should have been screaming 3 days later.
Right, but we do see 3 days later in there's I guess
For like 30 seconds.
yeah, for like 30 seconds you see like in I
With
guess a
dumb
tomb.
soundtrack.
Yeah, in this sort of tomb, you see like this cloth, which is I guess the clothes that Jesus was wearing when they buried him.
Yes, it would be the burial garments that they wrapped him in.
Yeah, and so then you see Jesus, and he's not all bloody anymore. But then he stands up and walks out of the tomb, but you can see that he's got holes in his hands, just to let you know that that this is after.
So I was incredibly disappointed with this scene overall for many reasons. But number one, I was told growing up in the IFB that one of the reasons why this movie was so wicked was that the end of the movie you saw Jesus' butt. And like, I was told that it was the director, that Mel Gibson had put his own butt in there. And that,
Really?
Yeah, so but I always thought the end of the movie was the end of the actual story in the Bible. Jesus comes out of the tomb. He meets his mother and other women that were part of his, like, that were disciples of his. The women run back and they tell all his regular disciples, and the men disciples are like, "What? Oh my God, we got to go see this." He meets with a couple of them, and then for 40 more days, Jesus is active on earth after his crucifixion, like after his death.
Just doing stuff. Like regular
Just doing
stuff.
like hanging out with his disciples, yeah, eating and like surprising people and teaching them more stuff. And then 40 days later, they're all up on a mountain, and God swishes them up into heaven in front of all their eyes. But that's called the ascension, when Jesus ascends into heaven.
So this is
in front of all the disciples' eyes.
So this movie has nothing really to do with anything that Jesus particularly taught. It just was all about Jesus being killed, the story of his death.
Right. So like we don't even get the good part of the end of the story of his death in our tradition is that he came back from the dead. That's the important part, because theologically for Christians, like I said a minute ago, redemption is not complete at the death of Jesus. Redemption is complete, like the part that takes us to heaven is that he died, was buried, and was resurrected. You've got to have all of died, buried, and resurrected.
But this is just died. That's all this is.
Died. And then you get like 30 seconds of the resurrection. The soundtrack behind the resurrection is dumb. And you don't even get to see the whole butt.
It's just like side butt.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but this butt has been played up to me for like 17 freaking years at this point. Of like, oh my God, so shocking. Divine butt. And like
divine booty.
Divine booty. And I finally get to the end of this stupid torture porn movie. And it's not even a whole butt. But then the movie like cuts out and it goes to credits. And I was totally expecting Jesus to get a post-credits scene, like, at the end of an Avengers movie.
Yes.
I thought Jesus was going to get I watched through the whole damn credits because I thought there was going to be like some kind of post-credit. Like Jesus was going to get like his Iron Man moment at the end. Nothing. Nothing.
Samuel L. Jackson's about to show up and be like, Jesus, we have another mission for you.
That's what the end should have been. That would have been better than the way they ended it.
Oh man, that was
Sorry, I just had to complain about that because like I really thought there was going to be a post-credit scene and there wasn't.
There was no post-credit scene. No, but so I heard, speaking of butts, but
watch out, you're going to get our show tagged as explicit.
So you've mentioned that the IFB really did not like this movie. They had huge problems with it. So aside from this holy booty, this holy badonkadonk,
stop.
What was it that the IFB really didn't like about this film?
So we were kind of told that this movie made the crucifixion very Hollywood, and I think somebody probably just came to that conclusion without having seen the movie, because this movie was pretty accurate. It was way more accurate to the way the Bible portrays this than I thought it would be in a million years. But we were told that kind of like, oh, it's these evil Hollywood people who don't even really believe in Jesus, who are just making this movie for money.
So that was one thing we heard about it. I heard that they were very upset because of the portrayal of the holy booty, which, as I have mentioned, was not even all that.
They could have shown way more butt than they did.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I kind of wish they had, because I thought the framing was odd. I thought it was weird. That's just me. And then the other thing is, so the IFB typically, they're not big fans of portrayals of Jesus. It's not forbidden. Like, some religions forbid iconography. Like, I know that this movie wasn't allowed to air, or wasn't allowed to be shown in certain countries because Muslims consider Jesus a prophet, and they consider it wrong to make just visual depictions of prophets.
It's absolutely haram.
Yeah, so this movie wasn't shown in certain countries where it would be considered offensive. IFBs don't completely prohibit visual depictions of Jesus, but they really discourage it. So if you go into a Catholic church, you will almost certainly see a depiction of a crucifix. And a crucifix is showing Jesus on a cross, like the body of Jesus on a cross in the act of being crucified. If you go into an IFB church, you will almost never see a crucifix. You will see a cross, like an empty cross without a person on it, but they don't do crucifixes because they are typically against portrayals that show Jesus in the act of being crucified, because they believe that that's too Catholic. So another misconception that Baptists or IFBs tend to have about a Catholic Mass is they tend to think that Catholics believe that Jesus is re-crucified every time the priest performs Mass. So what Catholics actually believe is that there's a connection between the original crucifixion of Jesus and the body and blood at every Mass that is consecrated. Baptists think that it refers, that the Mass, the consecrating the cookies and wine at Mass, that Baptists think that Catholics believe that we are crucifying Christ again every Sunday for Mass. And that's a misconception. But because of that misconception, Baptists tend to disdain images of Christ in the process of being crucified, and they prefer images of the living Christ, so post-crucifixion. So he's got holes in his hands, but other than that, he looks good.
Okay, see, that seems like very small sort of problems, but I guess if you're IFB, that's enough reason for them to say this movie is banned.
It's pretty much that, and also, like, they are completely and totally against going to the movies. And that's pretty much like goes back to Lester Roloff, Jack Hyles, and other guys like that who were against going to the movies. So Baptists are still against going to the movies. So even for a Christian movie, you would still not go to the movies.
So do you want to know what I was told about this movie when it first came out?
Oh, please.
In the Jewish community, this movie came out. This movie caused quite a stir for us, generally, because of me watching this movie, what I saw as blatant anti-Semitism. I don't know. Were you able to pick up on any of that?
I was able to pick up on some. I'm sure that you're going to have about twice as much, if not more, than I do. But if you want to kind of talk through some of what you noticed, I can jump in with like, yes, I saw that, or no, I didn't. So
here's a question for you then. Have you ever heard of a passion play?
Oh, yeah. I've been to like 12. Been in like 3.
So a passion play, for those who are not familiar, is basically like the story, this movie, the story of this movie, where it's a depiction of Jesus being crucified as a play, as like a theater show.
Yeah, typically it's a little bit more expanded. We get like a little bit before and a little bit after, but yes.
And usually these plays would happen during Lent, so just before Easter.
The 40 days before Easter.
Yes. So the Passion Play is a tradition that was started in the 1300s, and they were popular throughout Europe. And so they depict like the final days of Jesus, and it was very common in the Catholic Church to have a Passion Play sometime during Lent. But there is a very dark side to these Passion Plays, because in medieval Europe and, Renaissance era, and then following that up all the way through, up until like the 1900s, basically the Passion Play would often be used to spark a pogrom against the local Jewish community. So this so they would do this play. They would really put a lot of emphasis on the amount of violence that was committed against Jesus, and they would really put a lot of emphasis on, it's the Jews who were to blame for this. So this would spark a pogrom against the Jewish people, their local community. So basically the idea was that it would very aggressively blame the Jews for the death of Jesus, and then it would spark destruction of property, violent attacks, rape, murder, general prosecution or persecution. So they'd use these plays So say you were like a local leader, and you're living in like a Catholic country and people are mad because they don't have enough food. You can be like, oh, well, it's the Jews who are to blame. And this is what they would do. They would just be like, it's the Jews who are to blame because, it's their fault. They're doing Jew magic or something. Remember how they killed Jesus? Let's do on this play. They killed Jesus. Now you go, you murder a bunch of Jews, you get back, you're like, you got that out of your system. You attack them. So now you don't have to, come and turn on me, the local leader who's abusing you. So basically that's how these things would work. Now we know, so the Catholic Church, I want to talk about this because almost 60 years ago, the Catholic Church, in 1962, it went through a major transformation known as Vatican II. This transformation is probably the largest single shift in doctrine and policy since the beginning of the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah,
And
that's accurate.
yeah, and so basically anybody with half a brain knows that these were changes that they made, and they made things a lot better. One of the major changes worth noting here, for nearly 2 millennia, the official stance of the Catholic Church was that Jews are to blame for killing Jesus. This was the official stance of the Catholic Church for nearly 2,000 years. Vatican II changed this stance. And so since 1962 especially, relations between various Jewish and Catholic communities have significantly improved. Like they've gotten much, 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 much better. Mel Gibson, however, the writer, the director, and the producer of this movie, is a traditionalist Catholic. Specifically, he is what is known, I don't know if I'm saying this right, is a sedevacantist traditionalist Catholic, which means that he does not accept the legitimacy of Vatican II. This movie is going to be in line with what the Catholic Church was teaching. This will be basically a sanitized version of what the Catholic Church, like their official position was for nearly 2,000 years until 1962. Furthermore, we know for a fact that Mel Gibson really hates the Jews and is a huge anti-Semite, because in 2006, so about like 2 years after this movie came out, he was arrested for drunk driving. And he accused the arresting officer of being a Jew, and then, quote, and this is a direct quote from him, he said, "Jews are responsible for all of the wars in the world." So, yeah, so I knew about all of this stuff beforehand because, how could I not? And so I went into this movie watching it, and I'm like, looking at this, and I'm just like, it's bothering me so much. And maybe it makes sense to whatever the Christian narrative of the story is, but it seemed
Can I jump in on this?
Yes.
Okay, so the whole thing of the Jews killed Jesus, I was aware that historically that has been used to justify atrocities and acts of violence against specific Jewish people. I did not know that it is still a thing. Like, I didn't know that
of course it's still a thing.
Well, yeah, but like I thought like Nazis and thought that. I didn't know that this is prevalent in Christianity until we were researching an episode that has not come out yet, but we'll hear soon.
Yes.
I have very recently learned that like this is not as niche of a belief as I thought it was, because I grew up on the other side of Christianity. I grew up on the side that kind of fetishizes Jews, or wants, because I grew up on the other side of the theology, which we will explain to you in an episode very soon, so I'm not going to start. But I did not know that this was still a thing. I think the Christians that I am aware of I have to compare this, this might be a weird comparison, but I have to compare this movie to the play Jesus Christ Superstar,
Okay.
which I assume you haven't seen.
I haven't seen it. I've heard it's very good.
I think you would enjoy it a whole lot more than you enjoyed this movie.
Well, that's not
So-
saying that much. I hated this movie more than I hated Sheffy. Because Sheffy was was
no.
boring, but it wasn't racist. This was boring and racist and just brutally violent. How do you make a movie that's this like brutally violent and make it boring?
And this boring.
Yeah.
I mean, a sucky soundtrack didn't help.
Yeah, I hated the soundtrack. Soundtrack was terrible. They're just like,
soundtrack
and that's like every scene, and then Satan shows up.
No, so comparing this though to Jesus Christ Superstar, Jesus Christ Superstar was pretty. Honestly, we should watch it and review it for the podcast maybe next Easter.
I would love to.
But let's put that on our tentative schedule. But JCS, the reason that it was controversial amongst so many Christians is that it portrays Judas not as complicit in the death of Christ, but it portrays Judas as kind of a pawn in God's game of chess. So the Christian belief is, which I mentioned earlier, that Jesus had to consent to die on the cross. There are things that are vital to our salvation theology, and one of those things is that Jesus willingly laid down his life for us. It is not redemption if Jesus was forced or coerced into doing this thing. It only works if he willingly gave his life for all of our sins, which I think is a lot nicer to believe in than the idea that this poor guy was like sacrificed without without any choice in the matter. Jesus Christ Superstar portrayed Judas not as a villain, but kind of as a pawn in God's long game. And that's what people got really upset about was the implication that God would use someone like that. That's why Jesus Christ Superstar was one reason why it's so controversial. But in this movie, the idea that the Jewish high priest is responsible for the death of Jesus is antithetical to Christian theology, because we believe that Jesus laid down his life. If that guy hadn't been there to say, kill this guy, it would have been somebody else. If Jesus had been born into any country at any time, if Jesus was born into America today instead of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, he would still have gotten killed. It has nothing to do with the people who actually put him to death. Those people were just fulfilling prophecy.
Interesting.
It has literally nothing to do with them. So this idea that the Jews killed Jesus, that is so backwards to the theology that I was raised with, that it just doesn't even, like, it doesn't make sense, because like Jesus' death would have happened anyway. It would not have mattered who the ruling powers were.
That's an interesting take on it, because when I was watching this movie, at least how it was portrayed to me is that the Romans, Pilate and King Herod, they did not care about this thing. They're just like, we don't want to see extra violence. We don't want to see any, like, Pontius Pilate did everything that was within his power to keep them from killing Jesus. But man, those dirty Jews, they really persisted. They were really persistent that they wanted this guy murdered. And, we just had to go along with it. We were just following orders,
See, the idea that Pilate did everything that he could to prevent the death of Jesus, that's scriptural. Like, that's in there.
Okay, and see, that's...
he really didn't want to kill the guy.
So then that's what I wanted to get to then.
And that, like, the Jews really did want him dead. But putting the blame on the entire Jewish race is not scriptural. That's not founded in reality of the doctrine and the theology that we're taught.
Okay, so this is the thing, though. I want to talk about this narrative as it relates to the spread of Christianity. Okay?
Okay.
So in this was a while ago, but in our episode where we talked about the Christian Seder or whatever, I talked about basically how, from my perspective, I see Christianity as a religion that was meant to spread throughout the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire was mostly polytheistic. Getting them to worship the Jewish God was not going to be difficult, and getting them to see a sort of God/man hybrid as possible was not difficult either, because that's sort of how they saw the Roman emperor. But here lies the problem. Say you are a loyal Roman subject and I'm trying to convert you to Christianity, and I say, well, we have this very powerful God. He is the greatest God. He is the one true God. And there was this prophet who was his son, and he was the embodiment of God in the flesh, and through him everlasting life is possible. So you're going to say, oh, that sounds great, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But then I've got to get to the part where I say, but here's the thing. It's you guys that killed him. His death was caused by Roman imperialism. That's a problem, right? That would be a big problem. So
yeah,
if I'm writing this story out, I've got to figure out a way in which to tell this story in which the guy was able to be killed under Roman occupation and
by Roman
soldiers, but the Romans are not responsible for his death. And we're also somehow powerful to stop it, even though the symbol of the religion itself is the preferred Roman method of execution. So
yeah, so you've got to find somebody to blame.
Yeah, so you have
better.
Yeah, so you have this depiction of Jesus's death in religious texts that paints basically the Jews as the only ones who are responsible, and the Romans just sort of went along with it just because they had to, despite the fact that they had a massive empire with massively outsized military strength. They had no choice, and this to me makes absolutely zero sense. So basically, and I don't want to offend people here, because I'm speaking about texts that people hold very dearly. I think this is the way that I think it probably happened. For me, this is what I think probably happened, is that Jesus was probably a fairly radical rabbi who was a spiritual leader of some kind of revolt against the Roman occupation. He was crucified by the Romans for his crimes, as like a public demonstration. And he had amassed a certain number of followers before his death. After his death, stories become inflated, stories become legends, and this movement outlives him. But the story, which I think is probably what happened, is that the Romans are definitely the bad guys. So in order to make this whole story appeal to the Romans, as at least from where I see it, Christianity was a religion that was made to appeal to the Romans. You can portray individual Romans as being bad or cruel, but the Roman system, the Roman government itself they aren't the bad guys. They aren't the evil ones. The bad guys are the Jews. The bad guys are the priests in the temple, the religious system, not the Roman system, the religious system. It's the Jewish system that exists underneath the Roman system. And that's what we're seeing play out in this movie.
I mean, I think that makes total sense. And that concept of how Christianity came to be, I mean, there are parts of it that as a Christian I would disagree with, but that idea in general is not completely anti every Christian belief that there is.
No.
And I can't just sit here and say oh, that doesn't make sense.
Well, it might not make sense to you, and a lot of people listening to this, it might not make sense to them either. They might be like, this doesn't make sense to me at all, because they have very strong beliefs about it. This is how I sort of see this, and this is how I'm sort of able to reconcile this.
I guess what I would say is I don't have a problem with that being your conception of this, because I think you perceive that conception is hugely offensive to me, and that it's more of yeah, you got some stuff wrong, but whatever.
Yeah, I'm sure that I got some stuff wrong, but
it's not massively offensive to me. The truth is that, if I can be a little bit vulnerable,
go for it.
On this podcast, the truth is that we don't know. The truth is that to believe in scripture about someone who lived 2,000 years ago and supposedly did miracles and rose from the dead and responsible for the redemption of sins that I do now in 2021, that's not a logical belief. That's something that's faith. So it's not incredibly important to me to know the details of what happened, because I have what I believe happened, and that's important to me personally, but I don't know. How could I know? I
Right.
wasn't there. And I am not one of these people who believes that the Bible is, like, I believe that the Bible is the word of God, but how am I supposed to know 100% for sure that the Bible hasn't been tainted by outside influence, that it hasn't been mistranslated ever in 2,000 years? Really? How am I supposed to? I don't know that. I don't know. I believe, but I don't know. So I just feel like it would be hypocritical for me to sit here and say, oh, well, I know you're wrong.
Right.
Because I don't. Because neither one of us knows what happened back then.
Yeah, and I mean the thing, I don't know, the thing that me, like, I don't care what other people believe, because they're allowed to believe what they want, but the thing that really irks me about this movie isn't so much that Christians believe that this is what happened. The thing that irks me about this movie is that Mel Gibson decided to make this movie knowing what I know about him as and his motivations and his prejudices, decided to make this movie and focus on these events, and I understand the history of these events and the history of the portrayals of these events. That's like the issue for me.
Yeah, and I do agree at the bottom line that this movie had a definite anti-Jewish bent to it.
Sure. Absolutely.
I think that is really obvious, and that's something that is like, I don't know, it's very obvious. Do you want to circle back and talk about like the are we ready to move on to like one more topic?
Yeah, let's talk about other stuff. Okay. Let's talk about the funnier things about this movie.
Okay, I wanted to get a little bit into like the weird gratuitous violence, like why is this movie literally only about the violence?
Yes.
Can we talk about that for a minute?
So we can talk about that.
I told my husband that I was watching this movie to do the Easter episode about it, and his first response was, "Oh, the snuff film?"
But that's what it is.
Yeah, and then the second response was to warn, like, to actually get serious and warn me about the violence in this movie. This is my husband. My husband has seen me literally sit and eat pizza through the Slayer Trilogy, the Slayer Repentless Trilogy.
I don't know what that is.
Which it is an extended music video of like several Slayer songs back to back, and the plot of it is, the overall plot is like a prison riot that leads to many Nazis getting murdered. But there's also a subplot about Danny Trejo's wife's head getting cut off with a chainsaw. Danny Trejo's in it. That's kind of cool.
That's
but it's like extremely violent. And my husband has literally seen me like sit and eat pizza through that.
And so he's warning you about the violence
like
in this
metal
movie.
Music video. Yeah, like there's like metal music videos that are very violent, and I typically have no issue. Like I watched The Boys and was like on Amazon, it's like fine. And he's warning me about the violence in this, and I was like, oh my God, what is in this movie if it's so bad that he's warning me about it?
Yeah, so
he knows like my tolerance for these things.
Right. And now that I feel like we've gotten through all of like the theological stuff, we can really critique this movie as a film, How did you feel about the violence? Did you feel like it was too much for you?
For me, not really. There are things that like everybody has their thing, Some people can't do brains. Some people can't do fingernails. They're just like, everybody has that little thing that creeps them out.
You couldn't do the puncture scenes.
Piercings and punctures are things that I don't handle very well. The piercing the hand, I did have to look away for that. The other thing that really bothered me was the crown of thorns. And I'm going to tell you why. We need a little theme song for the childhood trauma moment of each episode.
Let's get like a little child singing or something. Jesus loves me, yes I know.
We gotta have something.
For the Bible tells me.
We need like some kind of little theme on the piano. It's like lots of bells. It's like do 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 do. And it's the theme for the childhood trauma moment of each episode.
No, I'm saying get the little children singing Jesus Loves Me like you had in the...
No, that was a teenage trauma where Jack Scott made me listen to that song while watching grossly violent things on the big screen. No, anyway, so the crown of thorns, the way that this was, I don't know who said this or at what point in my childhood, but I will tell you this scarred me for life. Descriptions of the crucifixion are really common in the IFB. There's this piece that goes around, and it's called A Physician Analyzes the Crucifixion by Dr. C. Truman Davis. I'm going to have this linked in the show notes if anybody wants to go through and read it. I was going to read the whole thing on air, and now I'm just like, never mind. So it goes through kind of the whole story in great detail. It talks about kind of hypothetically what medically would be the outcome of the different things that were done to Jesus. Let me see if I can find like a quote. Okay, so this part is talking about where Jesus has been nailed to the cross, and like the specific way that they nail you on the cross is meant to cause asphyxiation over time. So this is the quote talking about that. As the arms fatigued, great waves of cramp swept over the muscles, knotting them in deep, relentless, throbbing pain. With these cramps came the inability to push himself upward. Hanging by the arm, the pectoral muscles, the large muscles of the chest were paralyzed, and the intercostal muscles, the small muscles between the ribs, were unable to act. Air could be drawn into the lungs but could not be exhaled. Jesus fought to raise himself in order to get even one short breath. Finally, the carbon dioxide level increased in the lungs and the bloodstream, and the cramps partially subsided. So it talks about like the details of crucifixion, like how it was done and how it actually killed a person, which was usually by either sepsis or suffocation. Because when you're hung in that position, you're not able to breathe effectively. And that's the bottom line.
Interesting.
Right. Like how you died from that was often asphyxiation. And then when they were ready for people, so the soldiers who were responsible for the crucifixion, if somebody went on too long and didn't die, they would come by and break your legs, which leaves you unable to push.
Oh, and they showed that in the movie.
And there's a Christian theology reason why they didn't break Jesus' legs.
Why?
Because if you go all the way back to other stuff that we've talked about, Jesus is, in Christian theology, the final sacrifice. So in Jewish law, when they made animal sacrifices, the animal had to have no broken bones. And the way that the priest would slaughter the animal to sacrifice that animal in the temple was like part of that like kosher slaughter process is to avoid breaking any bones. So Jesus had to not have broken bones to like fulfill messianic prophecy.
That's interesting. I'd never even thought about that before, but okay.
Oh, dude, like that stuff goes so deep. We have not even scratched the surface of it. I don't think we're gonna have to do another episode because I don't think we're gonna have time. I thought we were gonna have time in this episode, and I think we're not.
No, but okay, that's wild.
What was I saying? Oh, this guy who writes like the super. So in the IFB, that's where I was going with this. It's like it's almost like a contest to see what preacher can write a more graphic and violent description of the crucifixion. And these preachers, they will read it from the pulpit, and it's something I don't know how to explain. Like,
it's just like gore fest where they're just like,
like getting more and more descriptive, like with how you talk about this pain. And I remember being in church a lot as a child and crying because I felt so bad about this, like somebody being tortured and treated like that. It was very painful for me to hear about as a kid. And I remember often I hated when anybody would start up on this because I knew I was going to cry. But part of this is like I was a child who hadn't been exposed to a lot of violence because I was growing up without a lot of video games or movies that might have violence in them. So this is like the only exposure to violence that I had, and it was really traumatic for me. And one thing that I remember, and I don't know what preacher said this, I don't know when, but I know I was little. They talked about the thorns from the crown of thorns that they put on Jesus' head going through, and I'm sorry, this is really gross, going through the back of his eyeballs, like essentially skewering his eyeballs in place so that he'd still be able to see but not be able to move his eyeballs independently anymore.
What?
And like that's like what would have happened. Like when they put the crown of thorns on you, the thorns would either go through the scalp and into the eyeballs or through the surrounding like tissue, like up under your orbital bone, and that his eyes would have been skewered.
That seems medically wrong.
I mean, yes, now it does, but I am still so freaked out by anything to do with eyeballs. I cannot handle it. My husband said the word eyeballs at dinner one time and I threw up.
Oh, wow.
I am that freaked out by eyeballs. And when I was watching this movie, I had like this flashback of somebody saying that in church, and my entire life fell into place. Like, this is why I'm freaked out by eyeballs. Oh my God.
Oh my God. Wow. Take this to therapy next time. You can be like, hey, guess what I learned?
So, like, my whole life I've been like, why am I so freaked out by this? Because generally I'm like, gore doesn't bother me very much as a person, but that's like one of like 3 things that really does. And like, while I was watching this movie, I realized that all of the 2 out of the 3 things that really bug me, like my 3 things I cannot do, are punctures, eyeballs, and brains. And 2 of the 3 of them are from this crucifixion story.
Wow. Okay. That's
that was like great for me, because I'm like, oh, that's where that comes from, is like hyper realistic, hyper graphic stories of crucifixion being told.
Except for that they're not realistic stories. They're just like some guys like torture porn fantasy, Jesus torture porn fantasy, which is essentially what this movie is.
Which is what this movie is. I'm sorry, I just had like that major revelation about my childhood, and I was like, oh, this is what I should talk about on my podcast.
Revelation, no pun intended.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to talk about some of the funnier things in this movie, because we've gotten through like the hatred, the story itself, the violence, the anti-Semitism, and your childhood trauma. But there's a few things in here that I really want to talk about. So the first that I wanted to say is that throughout this movie, very frequently there will be, flashback scenes. So in the movie, Jesus will see something, right? He will be looking at something, he will see it, and then it will remind him of something that happened in the past. And
yeah,
all of these flashback scenes feel super sexual to me. Did you pick up on that? Oh,
I totally did not.
You know the scene where he, like, at the beginning, I know he's there with his mother, literally with his mother, but he's making the table, and I'm just like, oh man, Jesus is looking sexy as right now. You know what I'm saying?
Okay, no, I did pick it up in that scene. I didn't in the other flashbacks. In that one, I was like, this is weird.
Yeah, where he's like, weird? I'm making a table. He's like, he like gets up and he sits on the table. He's like, this table's strong. Yeah.
The way he jumped on the table, that was it for me. I was like, wait.
Yeah, but
I don't know if I like this.
He's like making this table. He's looking shredded. Like he is. And the thing is,
which is interesting, because by the time we get to the crucifixion scenes, we got like dad bod Jesus going on.
I really, because
it's not super. It's not like super shredded Jesus.
See, yeah, because when he was making the table, right? He's making this table, and he's like, you could see his arms. His arms are like, and it's this sort of thing where he's not like, oh, I spend all day working out in the gym, kind of ripped. It's like, oh, it's not like, fitness model ripped. It's like working man ripped, which is like a tier above, I feel like. You know what I'm saying?
Which would make sense, though, because like historically, dude was a carpenter, so he was like lugging wood and chopping wood and stuff.
Yeah, so it's about to be like, the song "Work from Home" by Fifth Harmony?
Yeah.
Have you seen the music video for that?
No.
I feel like Jesus in this scene could really be in the music video for "Work from Home" by Fifth Harmony.
Oh my.
Yeah.
No, I did get it on that scene. I didn't get it on the other like flashback, because there's like how many flashback scenes? Like 4 or 5?
There's several of them, and a lot of them have really like sexual energy. There's a scene where he's whose feet are he washing? Is he washing?
It should be all the disciples.
I think he's washing Peter's feet, and it's like, he's like rubbing his feet and washing them. I'm just like, what is going on here? And the other thing that I noticed is, I've heard people speak. There are scenes where he's talking like Hebrew, he's speaking Aramaic. I don't know. When you hear people who are like native speakers of those of Hebrew talking, it's a very sort of like guttural kind of. I don't want to say guttural. That's not the right word, but it's like not a Jesus. All of his lines he was pronouncing like, that scene in Lord of the Rings when Aragorn is talking to Arwen, and he's like, and it's like they're in like that garden, and she gives him the even star, and he's talking all low and stuff. All of Jesus's line pronunciations were like this, instead of being like
Like normal speaking.
Yes, and so I'm just like, why
No,
is he?
you're right.
Is he trying to talk all sexy and stuff?
I think he's trying to be like prophetic, but
Yeah, it came across as like mad sexual energy. So I feel like somebody could recut this movie and make it look like the trailer for a porno.
oh my god. Like recut you mean the flashback scenes?
The flashback scene, also the scene at the beginning when he's like crying and he's like, oh, and he's all sweaty and
Oh my god.
yeah. What would we call it? What would we call the Jesus? It could be called
I mean, the Passion of the Christ.
the passion of the. I was gonna say glory holes, but
Oh no! Oh dear!
because the holes in his hands.
I have to thank you. I have to tell my dad not to listen to this episode. You have to tell me, please, if that goes in the Patreon cut or not, because
You'll just have to give him a time. You'll have to give him a timestamp. I'm not cutting that joke. That joke is too good.
okay, so now I have to tell my dad, don't listen to this episode, or don't listen to this minute of this episode.
He will not like.
I mean, I admit that that's funny, but oh my god.
Yeah, but like the scene with the table that keeps like coming back to me, like because I know that Jesus was supposed to be like a carpenter, right? But like, can you
Yeah.
imagine, like, say you were out like furniture shopping, like you were out of the thrift shop, right? You come across this really old fucking table, and it's all broken down and and you're like, who would pay $1,200 for that? And the salesman's like, oh, dude, you want this one? It's an original Jesus.
So I feel like that's ringing some bell way back in the back of my head about somebody who once said they had a table that Jesus made, like back in the Middle Ages or something.
Dude,
But I cannot put enough together to even Google it.
okay, that reminds me though, back in the Middle Ages, you know, when they did the Crusades, right? They up and like conquered Jerusalem, and then they decided just by, you know, arbitrarily, this is where this thing happened, this is where this thing, like they decided that one building was the building where the Last Supper happened, but that building wasn't built until like 700.
Yeah.
And that's the
And-
building that Leonardo da Vinci based his painting
Yeah.
on. Or was it Michelangelo? Who
wanna-
painted that painting?
It was Da Vinci who
Yeah,
painted
Leonardo
the
da
Last
Vinci.
Supper.
Yeah.
If you want to know where that building where the Last Supper was held actually was, I would recommend that you get my dad's book. It's called Where Was There? And it's on Amazon.
So
And it
you're gonna
talks
tell
about-
him. So is the plug of of your dad's book to make up for the joke that he's really not gonna like?
Yes.
Okay, that's why we had to put that in there.
I legitimately recommend his book. That, and if you're interested about like what the Bible actually says and some very cool historical context about the death of Christ, there's a book called The Day Christ Died, I think, by Jim Bishop. And that was, I found it interesting. I don't have independent verification for everything he says in the book, but if this interests you, I would recommend checking either one of those out.
Yeah. So would you like to know the one thing about this movie that I actually liked?
Yes.
So the one thing about this movie that I thought was actually a really, really cool portrayal and a really cool device, at least, was the portrayal of Satan.
Okay, so what did you think about Satan in this movie?
Well, I thought Satan looked like Voldemort in the Harry Potter movies, looked like Ralph Fiennes' Voldemort.
That's fair. I can see it.
Yeah, because obviously, you know, what are we used to when it comes to depictions of Satan? We're used to like
A lot of red.
oh yeah, a red-skinned man with devil horns, you know, has like a trident,
Like
flame,
shirtless, super ripped.
flames, you know, hoofs for feet, that
Yeah.
sort of deal,
Has a pitchfork.
a goatee.
Yeah.
So this was interesting to me because it was clear that, and I think that Voldemort is a good, like, that portrayal makes sort of sense because Voldemort's supposed to be like almost human but not quite. Satan was actually played by a woman. I don't know if you got that.
I did not pick up on that.
Yeah, so who was the woman that played it's this woman named Rosalinda Celentano or Celentano. most of the actors in this movie are Italian. It was very interesting because obviously Satan was portrayed as a man with like a male voice, but as almost like very slender, very, I want to say like snake-like, very reptilian almost in appearance. And it was this
extremely pale skin.
Yes. And so Satan, the way that Satan was portrayed was appearing almost human, but not quite. And so Satan can like walk through Jerusalem and people might be like, okay, that person looks like kind of a weirdo, but doesn't like, that isn't a demon, you know?
I mean, did you notice the anti-Semitism about how they framed Satan? Did you notice the thing that they did?
What did they do?
There's at least 2 scenes where the high priest is walking kind of in a circular pattern around Jesus being scourged, and Satan is right over his shoulder, like in the same frame.
Oh,
like they're
I
mirroring
didn't pick up
each
on that.
other's. Yeah, there are several. I think it's both. I think both of the ones I'm thinking of are during the scourging scene. But the camera is kind of panning right to left, and the high priest is walking through the crowd to get different views, like to try to get a 360 view of him being scourged, and Satan is literally right over the dude's left shoulder.
Yeah.
Like, mirroring his body language.
Interesting.
I just noticed that, and I was like, that looks like it was on purpose.
I'm sure that it was, though, because we know those things about Mel Gibson.
Yeah, I was cool with Satan in this movie.
What was the deal with Satan and that demonic child thing?
I do not know. I don't know what that was supposed to be. The thing where like all the kids, it's pretty early in the movie, but the thing where like all the kids chase Judas and like there's the like demon children biting at Judas.
Yes.
That's extra biblical.
And then Judas leaves town and hangs himself.
Literally the only part of that story that's in the Bible is that Judas went and hanged himself. And there's nuance that I felt like the movie really got wrong. I have no idea what that whole Satan with the demon child thing was about.
You know, I actually looked this up. Apparently, have you seen that painting that is Madonna and Child?
Yes.
So apparently they were trying to mirror that iconography, that visually, but with Satan and like a demon child rather than Mary and Jesus.
Okay, that seems kind of pointless, but whatever.
It's sort of like a thing that Mel Gibson seems to really like to do in this movie, where he'll like take a lot of medieval art.
I mean, I think that's a great idea to like try to mirror some really famous religious iconography. I think that's an awesome idea. I mean, I thought the scene at the foot of the cross was well done. I thought that mirroring that painting was a really great thing. But
yes.
I still don't get the demon child. I still think that was dumb.
That's sort of the point of this movie, though, is that I think this movie, the whole point of it was to portray this crucifixion in the way that is the most in line with like old, traditional medieval Europe as possible. Mm-hmm. As the way that would have been portrayed as possible. I guess the takeaway from that is that if you're going to do something like that, there is always going to be a heaping dose of anti-Semitism that comes with it, if that's what you want to do.
Right. And as from the Christian perspective, if we are going to make this thing that happened so long ago a part of our faith,
well, it's central to your faith. You can't make it not a part of your faith if you're a Christian.
Right. Like if this is something that we're going to be thinking about, like if this is something we're going to be dwelling on, I don't see the problem of having a movie made that portrays the crucifixion. I would have liked to have it, I would have liked to have it portray the days leading up to Jesus' death, because there's a lot of prophecy in there. There's a lot of meaningful moments for Christians. I would have liked to see it include the resurrection, because that's really freaking important. And I would also have liked to not see it be super racist.
Yeah.
Like if we could do that like there's no reason not to have a movie about the crucifixion. It's just that this one was not it.
So out of 10, marks out of 10, what are you giving this movie?
Ooh, on what? On like in general?
Yeah, just in general.
I'd give it a 4 out of 10. You'd probably give it a 0.
Yeah, I'm giving it a 0, just because for me, like Mel Gibson making a movie about the crucifixion, like in line with basically a tradition that intentionally targeted Jewish people, knowing what I know about Mel Gibson's hatred of Jews, that's just going to be a non-starter for me to begin with. As a movie, I'd give it like a 2. If you could take all of that stuff out of it, just the elements of a movie, I'd give it a 2 because it was just boring and not.
There wasn't. I mean, we started this whole episode. I found out that you didn't know about the political drama. And like literally Jesus Christ Superstar, which Andrew Lloyd Webber wrote, is better at explaining the political drama around Jesus' death than this movie is. And I feel like that's just a travesty. Like a freaking musical did it better.
The entire point of this movie is Jesus. Look how bad Jesus was tortured before he died, and then he died.
And that's like, so that misses every single point of the entire story except for one point, which is that like Jesus went through a lot.
It's like you miss the forest for the trees.
I mean, yeah, well, the suffering of Jesus is an important part of the story for Christians, but it's not the whole story. And it's not really the most important part of the story. Like, there's like 4 or 5 more important parts.
Yeah.
I think the movie kind of just missed the point. I don't see the point of portraying that kind of graphic violence the way this movie did with no payoff.
No context.
I would not personally have a problem with that level of violence being used for 30 minutes out of a 90-minute movie.
This movie was 2 hours long, and it was like an hour and 20 minutes of it was just Jesus getting tortured.
Right. That doesn't do anybody any good. Like, I don't see how this movie would be spiritually edifying. You know, if you wanted to make a Christian movie, I wouldn't be offended by the idea of making a movie like along the lines of, you know, a movie about the last week of Jesus' life between the entry into Jerusalem and his death and then his resurrection. I think that, why not? But like, why did it need to be like this? I don't get it.
Here's a question. If you could recast anybody as Jesus, who would you cast as Jesus?
Steve Carell.
Steve Carell as Jesus?
I literally don't know. He was just the first person that came to mind.
Really? You wouldn't pick like...
Literally just the first actor that came to my mind.
You wouldn't pick Kirk Cameron?
Oh God, no. Now I'm trying to think seriously.
John Travolta?
Oh God.
Yeah.
Ugh, I hate John Travolta.
I'm trying to think who would I pick as to play Jesus. I would
You know, Tim Minchin absolutely killed as Judas in the London production of Jesus Christ Superstar. I would give him a shot as Jesus.
You'd pick him as Jesus? I would pick...
I mean, I think he could do it. He showed incredible emotional depth as Judas. So, I don't know. I'd love to see the role. If I was going to recast Jesus, I would love to see the role go to an actor of color, like kind of do the Hamilton / Bridgerton like colorblind casting thing.
Right.
I think that's really effective.
You could have an Asian Jesus.
I mean, you could.
Yeah.
I really love I love the way that Hamilton was done and what that's led to with the TV show Bridgerton.
I haven't seen Bridgerton. Does it have colorblind casting?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So it's a TV show about old Britain, but there's black people in it.
It's a TV show about Regency. Yeah. Well, okay, so
interesting. Okay, that's
Regency England, but it's colorblind casting, and the way that they do it is very plausible, and there's kind of a frankness to it. It's not like tongue in cheek or coy. It's just very like, oh yeah, these are people and they're playing roles. That's it. And I like that. It feels very honest.
Of course, if you had Jesus played by anybody other than like a very sexy white man, a lot of people would get very angry about it.
Right. Like, I think that having a colorblind casting for anything regarding the Gospels would not only make the people mad that I would enjoy making mad, but it would also kind of open up for it would be, I think, a good idea, but it would also make the right people mad. So that would be a bonus.
Yeah. I mean, because, we don't actually know what Jesus looked like, did we?
Right. I remember my dad telling me, I was a like young teenager. I had kind of just gotten to my adult height. I'm about 5'5". If I get a chiropractic adjustment and then stand up straight, I'm 5'6". And I remember I had just kind of gotten to my adult height. I would have been like 15, 16. And my dad telling me that Jesus was probably shorter than I was. Like Jesus as an adult was probably my height or a little bit shorter.
Well, because
And
people
that
were
just
shorter back
blowing
then.
my mind. Yeah, because people were shorter like back then based on, archaeology that we have. And my dad was like, yeah, average Jewish man at the time was probably about 5'6", if not a little bit shorter. So, and I remember that blowing my mind when I was a teenager.
Jesus might have been super hairy and bald.
I mean,
He was
that's
Jewish, so
that's totally possible.
yeah, that's the thing, is that everybody in this movie, all the actors were Italian. Anyway,
Yeah.
I think we've gotten to the end of our rope here. Any final thoughts on this movie before we can go?
I was gonna say I liked the guy who played Jesus in the flashback scenes better than I did in the torture scenes.
Well, there wasn't a lot of acting to be done in the torture scenes. You just go, oh.
Yeah. My final thought about this movie is just how bad the soundtrack sucked. Like, I really hated the soundtrack to this movie.
That's true. The soundtrack, every scene they show Satan is like, yeah.
There was something redeemable about some parts of this movie. There was, in my opinion, just nothing redeemable about the soundtrack. I feel like this movie would have been way cooler with a better soundtrack.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you agree with me.
Yeah, I thought that the soundtrack kept taking me out of it rather than really.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, my final thoughts in this movie were I hated every minute of having to watch it. I thought that it was very stupid. I know, I'm sure you've seen the South Park movie, or the South Park episode where they made fun of this. And I
actually don't think I have.
Well, they did a South Park episode about it, and you can watch that now, and you'll probably think that it's very funny. But I mean, that Stan in that episode, he's like, you can't just show them torturing a guy for 2 hours and call that a movie. And that's my thoughts exactly.
I completely agree. I think that now that you've seen this movie, that might open up a discussion that I've been needing to get into, but requires a lot of research about a little bit more about messianic prophecy, and that we have danced around in several episodes, but we haven't really gotten deep into. So I think maybe having you see this movie will open up a discussion on that at some point in the future, which I'm excited for. But that's about the only saving grace of this movie, no pun intended, that I see.
Yeah. Anyway, if you like this episode more than you liked the movie The Passion of the Christ, which I enjoyed talking about Passion of the Christ more than I enjoyed watching Passion of the Christ, then you can follow our podcast on social media. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Leaving Eden Podcast, on Twitter at Leaving Eden Pod. You can join our Facebook group, which is called Eden Exodus. So if you go to Facebook, type in Eden Exodus in your search bar, it should pop right up. If you want to listen to extended episodes and, help support the show financially, you can go to patreon.com/Leaving Eden Podcast and join there. We do have some benefits for you there. You can also purchase some of our merchandise, which is now available. We have t-shirts and we have mugs of both Pastor Jack's Texas Style Poison and Mountain Moo. So, Sadie, would you like to plug your social media?
Yeah, you can follow me on Instagram at Sadie Carpenter Music, or on Twitter at HellYesSadie.
And you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Clubhouse at GAVRIELHACOHEN. And if you like the song that is playing right now, you can go and stream that, or you can download it, and all of the proceeds from that go to help promote this show. And if you want to go stream that, there's going to be a link in the show notes, in the show description. And you can also find it by going to my Spotify, Apple Music, whatever streaming service you use page. It's Gabriel Hakohen. You can find it there. And until next time, we have some great episodes coming for you next week. We have a 2-parter coming right up, which is going to be super fun. We're going to get into all sorts of really cool stuff. So stay tuned for that. And until then, you guys have a nice day. Bye-bye.
But old rolling river of time, you healed me in too many days. No regrets, no confusion, there'll be no pollution. I'm so thankful I've decided to change my ways. I'm so thankful I decided